Hey there folks, my name's Gray, this is Consoletronix, where today I'll be revisiting an old favourite as I'll be getting to grips with Sega's shuriken-slinging Shadow Warrior Joe Musashi with my look at the 1987 arcade classic and the many home conversions of Shinobi.
Mission 1.
The history of Sega as a company has been littered with losses and strewn with success in near equal measure, from the many hardware failures from the SG-1000 to the 32X and many more in between. But on the arcade front, starting in the mid-1980s, Sega would initiate a golden age, not just for themselves, but for the very industry itself. And it's into this era of sprite scaling successes following coin-op hits like Outrun, Afterburner and Space Harrier that a nondescript platformer would be released in 1987 whose challenging missions, catchy music and rock-solid gameplay would capture the interest of gamers beginning to tire of the more gimmicky titles around. And it's from these humble origins, the story of Shinobi would, like the saga of its creators Sega, take many twists and turns in the years to come. One of the jewels of the Sega arcade catalogue appearing on the NEC PC engine. And while the thought of such a collab fires up the fanboy within me, weren't the two companies bitter domestic rivals in 1989 when this Japanese exclusive port came out, with NEC consistently outselling the recently released Sega Mega Drive and keeping it third in the 16-bit race in Japan? Maybe that's why Sega would pull out all the stops with Revenge of Shinobi released the same year. But for all the maybes and what ifs, one thing I can say with concrete certainty is that this port is a blinder. But it wouldn't be the only 16-bit port, as we'll discover later. We drop down from the 16-bit PC Engine to the 1-bit Commodore 64 now, to marvel that the aging hardware was still in fact kicking in 89, and still had a few more years in it, incredibly. I don't know about stateside, but here in Europe it wouldn't be until the release of the Mega Drive and SNES before consoles truly replaced the old computer systems. And the C64 struggles, as you'd expect, trying to replicate the feel of the arcade, but does a better job than you'd think, with fast-paced action and tip-top gameplay. Mastertronics, the company behind these computer versions, were no stranger to all things Sega, as before they were bought out by Virgin, they actually distributed the Master System in Europe. They're the reason the system was so popular over here, but a flop everywhere else. It's why eventually they wound up becoming Sega UK. And what's that got to do with the garishly coloured specky port of Shinobi? Absolutely nothing. But while stodgy and basic, the 128K release has some good music and is overall a bit of fun.
Mission 1.
I swear anyone who grew up owning an Amstrad computer, you have my sympathies, because you all had your childhood stolen from you. Say what you will about the specky, but at least programmers figured out how to produce fast-paced fun, albeit cut-down games. Whereas everything I've played on a CPC feels so slow and stodgy. And while there's a decent enough little game in here, compared to other versions on contemporary machines, it pales in comparison. surprise to me to see a European exclusive MSX port here, as Mastertronics started out selling budget games to systems nobody remembers or will even admit to having owned. I myself grew up with a Commodore C16+4, which ironically was released by Commodore to compete directly with the MSX, and only Mastertronics really supported it with software. But while the MSX had some success in its native Japan, it didn't make much of an impression in the well catered for computer scene of the UK, particularly when most of its European game library consisted of sloppy second Spectrum ports that looked and played like dog's vomit. Finally, we can leave behind all those 8-bit micro distractions and look at some console ports. And we start with this US exclusive NES version brought to us by Tengen. No, not the Demon Slayer, but the old Atari offshoot who seemingly only existed to annoy both Sega and Nintendo, as they would put out unofficial releases, or at least unofficial in the sense that they made their own cartridges, bypassing Nintendo's lucrative pay us to make them policy, which, if you didn't know, is the real reason why the N64 was cartridge based. And while this is all very interesting, the most interesting aspect I could find about this staggeringly shit game was the cover is inspired by the old Shokasugi ninja flick Pray for Death.
Mission 1.
Considering I went into making this video with a spring in my step and a song in my heart, as I am a massive Shinobi fan, but bloody hell, I had no idea there were so many shit ports out there. And I teased it earlier, but here's the second 16-bit version running on the Commodore Amiga. There are also Atari ST and PC ports knocking about, but if they're anything like this, then I choose blissful ignorance. And while the Amiga was a capable machine in the right hands, more often than not, ports like this were rushed and lazy affairs. Imagine, if you will, what Sega themselves could have done. Well, imagine no further, because without question the best home port of Shinobi was the Sega developed Master System version. And while many would say the PC Engine's slick conversion is closer to the arcade original, Sega wisely chose to focus on the strengths of the Master System rather than try to cram the arcade into 8 bits. The result is arguably one of the best games the system ever possessed, and is highly regarded by Master System owners like myself to this very day. So that's the end. I hope you enjoyed. This was originally something of a throwaway video, but I've actually enjoyed discovering many of these ports that I never played. I didn't even know the MSX still had a presence in Europe in 1989, let alone a version of Shinobi running on it. So before I leave you, I'll let you guys decide, would you like to see me do more videos like this, looking at every version of something? Shadow Dancer springs to mind, or maybe you'd like to suggest something in the comments. So thanks for watching, and until the next time, goodbye.